Aloha mai kako. Anyone who's in this room and is not a member of the Hawaiian Historical Society, make sure you sign up before you leave. Great benefits, a very low cost to membership. You get a Hawaiian Journal of History mailed to you, a free copy of the journal mailed to you every year that you continue your membership. This year's journal, the cover story is written by Ralph Cam, a researcher here in Hawaii, who has written an article on the birth date of Kauikeaoli. There's been a lot of debate and about the actual birth date of Kauikeaoli. He's done some prolific research with moon phases, with primary sources and other things, and determined the actual birth date of Kauikeaoli. So that'll be the cover article, which ties in with the Kamehameha III Kauikeaoli statue that's recently been placed in Thomas Square Park. So a lot of ties there. So get your membership, you'll get the journal, you get our calendar that we come out with every year, and the knowledge that you've helped support a 126-year-old institution that preserves and gives access to Hawaiian history. So please do sign up before you leave if you haven't. Also, I wanted to mention, coming up before the end of this year, we have our book sale coming at Hawaiian Historical Society. We also have, as I mentioned, the calendar coming out. So with that said, our speaker tonight is Dr. Tiffany Ing, yes, who is a brilliant up-and-coming Kanaka scholar who has done her work on a lot of different work, but has done her majority of her work on Kalakaua. She has a PhD in English from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I'm going to invite a close friend of hers, actually her husband, to come up and introduce her. His name is Michael Sai. Michael's a lecturer, also an author. He published this book, The People's Race, in case you're interested in Honolulu and the marathon. So an author, a scholar, and also somebody that knows Tiffany quite well. We'll introduce her now. Mahalo.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for being here with us tonight. As Ron mentioned, I'm Tiffany's husband, so tells you a little bit about the budget that we're working with, and also about our lack of a vetting process. But we'll get to this together. Seriously, it's a great honor for me to introduce you tonight to, of course, my favorite teacher and scholar. As we'll see tonight, Tiffany is someone whose work we will find prompts us to reconsider what we have learned and come to expect or come to accept about the reign of King Kalakaua and the events leading up to the unlawful overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. When I first met Tiffany, she had recently completed a bachelor's degree in English from Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, and was enrolled in an MA in English program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She was working with Craig Howes on a project that took a look at Kalakaua's book, Legends and Myths of Hawaii. And I thought this was a fascinating project when I met her in a life writing course. And as she would explain later, the genesis for her interest in the king had roots in a Hawaiian studies class that she had taken. And in that class, during a discussion about Kalakaua, she heard her classmates, young Hawaiian scholars like herself, disparaging Kalakaua as these familiar things we hear. A drunk, a spendthrift, a fool whose indifference and ineptitude facilitated the annexation of Hawaii by the United States. Now for Tiffany, this was shocking and unsettling. Beyond that, it's acceptance, its internalization by her fellow students made her wonder what this ultimately meant for the Hawaiian nation, right? To have to reconcile this supposed reality with their identity. And in her thesis, To Be or Not to Be, that was not the question. Tiffany argued that Legends and Myths of Hawaii, Kalakaua's book, was more than cultural preservation for its own sake. It was, in fact, part of an wide-ranging political strategy to revitalize Hawaiian culture as a means of asserting native sovereignty and to resist efforts by American businessmen and other vested interests intent on delivering Hawaii into the control of the American government. Now, I ran into Tiffany several years later when we were both starting off as lecturers here at KCC. And by that time, she was in the midst of a much more ambitious project, her PhD dissertation, in which she would attempt to dispel more than a century of historical inaccuracy and intentional misrepresentation of Kalakaua's reign and present an accounting of the myriad ways in which this gifted, highly refined, forward-thinking mo'i sought to resist the forces aligned against the kingdom. Not through direct opposition, which would have only hastened the inevitable, of course, but by forging strategic alliances, by carefully elevating the image of the kingdom abroad, and by personally embodying the ideals of the Victorian age. Now, the work required to make this argument was and is staggering, and this is something that I've had the privilege to witness firsthand over the decade of courtship and marriage that we have shared. I watched Tiffany as she worked deep into the night and early into the morning, carefully translating the literally hundreds of Hawaiian language newspaper articles from which she would retrieve knowledge that had been long lost and discounted. I saw her spend hours and hours researching proper translation for words and phrases and spellings that were unique to the period. I rode along with her during trips to the Big Island and Kauai and Maui as she sought to pin down the exact location for places whose names had been long overturned or changed. I watched her devote countless hours to reading and rereading the same flawed text that she hoped to one day render obsolete, fulfilling her scholarly responsibility to give credit where it was due, to ensure that her criticisms and corrections were properly focused, solidly grounded, and fair. In 2015, Tiffany successfully defended her doctoral thesis, which he has asked me not to pronounce. The dissertation was one of two outstanding works, along with Aloha Lani Brown's Facing the Spears of Change, The Life and Legacy of John Papa'i'i, recognized with the 2015 Center for Biographical Research's Biography Prize. It is the basis for her forthcoming book, Reclaiming Kalakaua, which is due for publication next year by University of Hawaii Press. As I was mentioning in the introduction, or as I was preparing this introduction, Tiffany asked me to just mention one thing, and that is that her proudest accomplishment is the family that she and I have built with our young son, Eddie, who turns 2 in a couple of months. And here is where I really think that Tiffany's work will be most meaningful. Because of her, because of the rising generation of young Hawaiian scholars of which she is a part, because of the great scholars who came before, who blazed the trail and generously passed along their guidance and their knowledge, our son, Eddie, will grow up knowing that the leaders of the Hawaiian kingdom acquitted themselves honorably until the end, that scholarship is an integral part of his native Hawaiian culture, and that the words of his Hawaiian-speaking forebears provide a path toward the truth. So, ladies and gentlemen, Eddie's mom, Dr. Tiffany Ing.
Hi, I have a really fast question. For those of you sitting in the back, if I put more chairs on this side, do you want to move forward? Can you see the projector screen? You're okay? Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Sherry.
Are you good?
Yeah. Aloha kākou apau. Mahalo. I'm Hapai, and at 42, Mahalo kia kua. Mahalo kia kua. So I ask for your patience with me. I asked them to sit through this presentation because it's just easier for me. Standing while I lecture is a little bit demanding for me. So if you bear with me, I would appreciate it. So mahalo to all of you for coming this evening. Mahalo to Elizabeth Seaton and Jennifer Higa with the Hawaiian Historical Society. Mahalo for thinking that my research was worthy of this evening. Intense planning, organizing, and hard work. Mahalo to the Hawaiian Historical Society board members for supporting this talk and the implications of my research, and for taking a risk on a fledgling self-proclaimed scholar. Thank you, David Uidoi and the International Cafe for co-sponsoring tonight's event. Sherry Tamashiro, Nava'a Napoleon, Lisa Kanai, and the Native Hawaiian Academic Advancement Program here at KCC for your support. And to Kapi'olani Community College for allowing us to attend tonight's event against the backdrop of beautiful Leahi. Mahalo. Mahalo to Craig Howells for helping me with this talk. To my family and to my husband for that introduction. Mahalo. At 2 o'clock in the morning of July 6, 1887, the Hawaiian League and the Honolulu Rifles forced King David Kalakaua to sign their new constitution and install their members in the cabinet. Members of these two groups would later overthrow Queen Liliuokalani in 1893. But this moment in 1887 marked the beginning of the loss of Native Hawaiian sovereignty. The new constitution abolished Kalakaua's veto right, creating the situation advocated by the Hawaii-based English language and anti-monarchy newspaper, the Hawaiian Gazette, edited by Alatau T. Atkinson and published by Henry M. Whitney on June 28, 1887, which said, "Nothing but a cabinet composed of upright and able men, and a distinct understanding that the king shall reign but not rule, will satisfy the people." Kalakaua and his cabinet were accused of corruption and a failure to act for the good of the people, that is, the upright and able men of the Hawaiian League. Jonathan Osorio, Daviana McGregor, and David William Earl have carefully laid out and analyzed the imposition of the Bayonet Constitution. In my forthcoming book with UH Press, Reclaiming Kalakaua, 19th Century Perspectives on a Hawaiian Sovereign, I focus on how Hawaii's newspapers variously represented Kalakaua during this reduction of his powers and authority. For as Earl has pointed out, these publications provide the best source on the detail and scope of political debate in Hawaii at that time, that is 1887 to 1890, and certainly provide us with an account of the major and most influential political viewpoints. Tonight, I will discuss how pro-American businessmen and missionary descendants set the stage for the imposition of the Bayonet Constitution by threatening the king in 19th century English language newspapers before forcing him to sign their 1887 Constitution. Missionaries arrived in Hawaii throughout the 1820s and quickly converted many Native Hawaiians, including royalty, to Christianity. Some descendants of these missionaries married with Hawaiian nobles and were awarded prominent government positions and land holdings. Most others had different plans. As early as May of 1861, Sophia Craycroft, niece of the famous explorer Admiral Sir John Franklin, when visiting Hawaii with his widow, Lady Franklin, as the honored guests of the Mo'i Kamehameha IV and Queen Emma, observed that The missionaries have mingled secularity, that is simple money getting, with their high functions, and these have sat lightly upon many of them. Furthermore, she wrote, they are Americans and have naturally been the means of introducing Americans into nearly all the offices. And there is but one mind among them, that is, that this kingdom ought to be annexed to the United States. Another visitor who noticed these qualities of the missionary party during Kalakaua's reign was Isabel Field, the stepdaughter of Robert Louis Stevenson and the wife of painter Joseph Strong. Though she arrived 22 years after Craycroft, just prior to Kalakaua's coronation in 1883, she described Honolulu's Haole elite as rich, prosperous American businessmen with one aim: to wrest the islands from the natives and have it taken over by the United States. These missionary descendants in the government benefited from and continued to lobby for privatized land holdings, which politically and economically disenfranchised Native Hawaiians. When King Kalakaua ascended the throne, Hawaiians had been and were continuing to die at incredible rates. The kingdom foresaw the loss of Pearl River, now known as Pearl Harbor, to the United States, which could lead to annexation, and Haole amassing extensive property and building sugar plantations throughout the archipelago. Hawaii's swelling agricultural value and its politically advantageous location in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, an ideal supply center between Asia and the United States, made the islands increasingly indispensable to American and international interests. To protect their own investments and to get their hands on more land, foreigners sought complete political power. And to do that, they would have to overthrow the monarchy. Noenoe Silva writes that by continually asserting King Kalakaua's and later Queen Liliuokalani's incompetence to rule over Hawaii, the white oligarchy could make its occupation of the islands seem inevitable, if not exactly wanted. Some of the king's strongest opponents were missionary descendants and members of Hawaii's white oligarchy, prominent members of the Hawaiian League and the Honolulu Rifles, those who forced Kalakaua to sign the Bayonet Constitution and ultimately the Annexation Club and the so-called Committee of Safety, responsible for the overthrow. Among the notable members were Lorne A. Thurston, Sanford B. Dole, W.O. Smith, William D. Alexander, Thomas G. Thrum, Charles R. Bishop, William R. Castle, Sereno Bishop, John T. Waterhouse, Clarence W. Ashford, Bonnie A. Ashford, Alatau Atkinson, and others. Although this white oligarchy that sought to bring Kalakaua down was tiny in numbers, its wealth from its agricultural, legal, and other business sources gave it great political and economic power in the kingdom, and they exercised it. For instance, William R. Castle, a founder of the later Big Five company, Castle & Cook, and Henry P. Baldwin, who served a similar role in relation to Alexander and Baldwin, built empires of wealth in Hawaii out of profits drawn from real estate and sugarcane plantations. Sugar had already become immensely profitable. Profitable for the white oligarchy, and resources and restrictions on its ambitions was unthinkable. By the mid-1880s, Kalakaua's dedicated efforts in Washington and elsewhere on behalf of the sugar industry had brought substantial profits to Hawaii. But the industry was well established before his reign, and its leaders were already heavily involved in conducting international diplomacy and setting government policy. As early as 1849, the founders of one of the earliest plantations, Henry A. Pierce and Company, were the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, Henry Augustus Pierce, Supreme Court Justice William Little Lee, and banker and eventual pro-annexationist Charles Reed Bishop. All three had been involved in unsuccessful reciprocity treaty negotiations for America, and Lee went to Washington, D.C. in 1855 specifically to arrange for Hawaiian sugar to enter the U.S. Duty tax-free. At least partially due to Kalakaua's efforts during his reign, treaties, water diversion, machinery, and rail transformed the sugar trade. After the 1875 Reciprocity Treaty that Kalakaua personally helped to negotiate with the U.S. Congress, more than 100 investors opened sugar plantations in the islands. And their appetite for more land, more water, more laborers, faster and more efficient machinery, speedier ways to transport their sugar, and above all, increased profits, led to seeking greater power in the government, regardless of how cooperative Kalakaua might be. The scale of operations was huge. The famous Scottish travel writer, landscape painter, and visitor to Hawaii, Constance Frederica Gordon Cumming, observing sugar's influence upon Hawaii's economy, wrote that in 1883, a new sugar refinery built in San Francisco in response to Hawaii's growing production could accommodate 2,250 million pounds. Is that correct? I'm an English major, not a math major, of sugar a year. Of all the various demands the sugar planters made, the one the mo'i, an enthusiastic fan of new technology, responded to most was the desire for rail. Kalakaua had ridden across the U.S. on a train on his trip to Washington, D.C. in 1874. On August 1st, 1878, he signed an act to promote the construction of railways, which created a rail boom in the islands and a sugar boom for the planters. In his memoir of his visits to Hawaii in the 1880s, the Reverend Gowen made the following observation about the sugar barons' hold on the island's economy. He said, "It is sugar which has caused the present political importance of Hawaii, which has been the cause of her commercial prosperity, which has attracted the vast majority of her foreign population, which has made her merchants millionaires." Haole businessmen, some attracted to the islands because of the Reciprocity Treaty, were soon building railroads and mills to expand their stakes in the sugar industry. Unfortunately, the prosperity such leadership brought the wealthy businessmen only provided them with more resources to press for greater direct control, making the mo'i irrelevant and ultimately removing him from consideration altogether. That Kalakaua's effectiveness in publicly providing incentives for business would prove to be one of the causes for an ever-increasing desire for annexation of his nation to the United States is one of the biggest or grimmest ironies of his reign. I'll say that again, that Kalakaua's effectiveness in publicly providing incentives for business would prove to be one of the causes of an ever-increasing desire for annexation of his nation to the United States is one of the grimmest ironies of his reign. By far, the white oligarchy did the most damage to Kalakaua's reputation, proliferating lies that mimicked the course of American imperialism. In his study of this time period, Nicholas R. Schweitzer noted that when they actually overthrew the monarchy 2 years after Kalakaua's death, the missionaries/planters/businessmen were not likely to accept the restoration of native authority at a time when the colonial tide in the Pacific and elsewhere was reaching the high water mark. Everything had to be planned meticulously, and the timing had to be right. And Lauren Thurston at that time claimed that American property interests in Hawaii have become so great that it is no longer a simple question of political advantage to the United States or of charity or justice to a weak neighbor. But accompanying this perceived necessity of a takeover for mercenary interests was the claim that in any case, Kalakaua and then Liliuokalani had proved utterly unfit to govern the kingdom. There was never any shortage of public attacks on the supposed incompetence of the entire monarchical system. In 1874, Kalakaua campaigned against Queen Emma for the throne after Lunalilo died without naming his successor. Once Kalakaua's name was announced as the victor, a small group of Emma supporters rioted the courthouse. Kalakaua supporters rightly feared that the newspapers would sensationalize stories of the 1874 election riot. And the advertiser article, Our Riot Abroad, suggested that Kalakaua did not have the public's approval, or as Jonathan Osorio put it, the press portrayed the mutiny as a typical example of the natives' lack of discipline and a sign of disrespect for the king. The Hawaiian Gazette added this commentary: "It was a piteous sight. It gave great delight to those who contemptuously asserted that Hawaiian civilization was a sham, and that Hawaiians were unfit for self-government." The Hawaiian Gazette further declared that because Kalakaua requested the aid of U.S. and British warships to control the riot, he could not govern his kingdom and depended upon foreign intervention to maintain any control. As Kalakaua's reign progressed, the white oligarchy became emboldened and took to the newspapers to publish their attacks on the king. It should be noted that from 1876 until the middle of 1880, newspaper critiques of Kalakaua were infrequent and relatively restrained. He had pacified the planters for a time by securing a reciprocity treaty that guaranteed their prosperity. But then in June of 1882, more than a year before his coronation ceremonies, the Hawaiian Gazette had already called the celebration unnecessary and therefore a mere waste of money. Then there is this dismissive declaration from 1882 in the Hawaiian Gazette: "A sham. Talk of it as we may, theorize about it as we please, we must always arrive at one result, and that is that the constitutional government of these islands is a thorough sham." A year later, the Hawaiian Gazette declared that the formalities of the coronation were designed to play upon the king's vanity. Liliuokalani noted this in her book, Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen, when describing the opposition to the king's coronation. "Naturally," she said, "those among us who did not desire to have Hawaii remain a nation would look on an expenditure of this kind as worse than wasted." Attacks on the mo'i soon became institutionalized. In 1885, Thomas G. Thrum, who by that time had been a writer, an editor, a printer, was producing on his own press, the Hawaiian Almanac and Annual, and other substantial volumes on Hawaii's history. His annual summaries of the events of the previous year were often attacks on Kalakaua and his supporters. Thrum, Louis T. Valentine, and Arthur Johnstone collaborated to produce the Daily Honolulu Press, another newspaper. Replacing Thrum's Saturday Press, the new paper was explicitly dedicated to curbing the king's alleged reckless spending and incompetence. It ran for a year, and its December 4th issue reprinted a San Francisco Post article entitled "A Wild Scheme," which reported that the mo'i was attempting to sell his kingdom for $14,500,000. Treating this report as the truth, the paper editorialized that the painful fact has been patent for several years that King Kalakaua is not a popular sovereign at home, and of course, his people are entirely ignorant of any proposition for selling them out. The American papers claiming that Kalakaua's subjects were dissatisfied with him were usually passing on information from their principal sources, the missionary and business party. What truly aggravated Kalakaua's enemies, according to Daviana McGregor, was his unwillingness to renew the expired Reciprocity Treaty in 1886. In the summer of 1887, the environment in Honolulu became agitated, as the English language newspapers illustrate. The language used to attack the king and Walter Mary Gibson became increasingly threatening. While Kanaka Maoli and the white oligarchy felt that they had justifiable reasons for questioning Kalakaua's spending, the white oligarchy saw it as wasteful because it opposed the king's attempts to legitimize the Hawaiian throne and nation. The Daily Bulletin presented it this way on June 27, 1887. A series of follies, it said, incongruities, and public injuries unparalleled in any free country is presented to view in the recent history of this small kingdom. If ever power was used for purely selfish purposes by the ruler of a nation, it has been so used by the ruler of this country. Take merely the brief period that has elapsed since the legislature adjourned, less than a year ago, and see how the taxes of the people have been expended. The walls of the palace ground have been stuccoed, and the gates put down and re-erected. A warship has been bought and fitted up. A company of people has been sent to Europe. That's for the Queen's Jubilee. An embassy has been dispatched to Samoa. An array of idle army officials has been paid large salaries. A jubilee has been celebrated, etc., at considerable cost to the country. We, the taxpayers, have seen these things, but what benefit are they to us? How much has been expended in our interest? We have been ignored and our interests neglected. As historian Ralph S. Kuykendall, hardly a critic of the business oligarchy, explains, those foreigners who were undeniably paying the bulk of the already low taxes because they now own most of the income-producing property in the kingdom, saw almost any royal outlay as extravagant and wasteful spending that might lead to tax hikes. The bulletin emphasizes this point. We complain, and justly complain. We are forced to it by the wrong use of our money. The king has taken our taxes, which many of us can ill afford to pay, and diverted them from their legitimate purposes. The repeated wrongs inflicted on the people by this one man's absolute power have produced a deep feeling of dissatisfaction. Bitter murmurings come from many hearts and lips. The king should know it. The people are thoroughly convinced that there must be some division of power, and as they contribute the means of government, they consider themselves justly entitled to the principal share of power. A wise man would see the signs of the times and realize that the present sentiment of this community cannot be trifled with. The Daily Bulletin became increasingly personal and oppositional. The article Excitement says, "It cannot be forgotten that His Majesty has usually been guided by his own will and whim, and not the wish of the taxpayers and the good of the country. Any ministry that may have been acceptable to the country and endeavored to expend the public revenue for internal development and improvement has had short life. While on the other hand, ministers destitute of principle and patriotism and ready to misuse the public funds held in trust by them for the furtherance of the king's crack-brained notions and schemes have been tenaciously held onto. We are not in the humor to accept any compromise that will allow an opening for a reproduction in the future of what we have had too much in the past." Here, however, is one of the earliest threats to disempower the king. The bulletin says, "The king must be prepared to take his own proper place and be content to reign without ruling. We want capable, responsible ministers, not irresponsible clerks. Having appointed these ministers, the king should keep his hands off and let the work of government to them. This is one important point which the community should be prepared to insist upon, and we believe it is. Then the bulletin calls people to action. It says, "Gentlemen, you know your rights. Demand them to the full and be content with no half measures." In the same edition of the Daily Bulletin, an editorial signed by a friend of the Hawaiians claimed that the white oligarchy was responsible for Hawaii's prosperity. It said, "Intelligent Hawaiians understand that Hawaii, as it now exists, belongs to the foreigners who made it what it is, and the natives enjoy equal advantages with the foreigners without having contributed a cent of the expense. If the foreigners took everything with them that belongs to them, the country would be stripped of all its wealth, fixed and movable, and the king and his people would be left with their breech clouts and taboo sticks." To gain complete control of the kingdom, the white oligarchy knew that it had to oust Prime Minister Walter Murray Gibson. In the Shepherd Saint of Lanai, Thrum attacks Gibson because he has taken on the championship of the Hawaiian race, and in doing so, he has not hesitated to belittle the work of those who have done much, if not all, that has been done for the Hawaiian people. Others attacked Gibson for having influence over Kalakaua. While Gibson was certainly a flamboyant and flawed character, what seems to have angered the opposition most was the idea that a Caucasian could be such a traitor to his own race. Another example of their fundamental belief that what they wanted was the only acceptable outcome, and so anything that resisted that needed to be viciously attacked and eventually expelled. The Queen confirms in Hawaii's story that, added to the paper's methodical scare tactics against Gibson and the king, was the constant danger Kalakaua found himself in as he moved about Honolulu. She wrote, "His movements of late have been watched, and his steps dogged, as though he had been a fugitive from justice. Whenever he attempted to go out in the evening, either to call at a hotel or visit one of his friends' houses, he was conscious of the presence of enemies who were following stealthily on his track." The white oligarchy could not take much more, but the Hawaiian League and the Honolulu Rifles, originally formed to be the King's Army, but now composed of more than 300 Haole volunteers, did was publish accounts of their activities, according to David William Earl, to fuel public antagonism, especially in the Haole and foreign community, against the throne. While secretive at first about their meetings, in 1887, the League and the Rifles used the newspapers to declare their presence, which Jonathan Osorio notes exemplified the treacherous political climate of the time. And in some cases, through juxtaposition and layout, the papers added to the intimidation. For example, on June 29, 1887, the Bulletin announced a Honolulu Rifles meeting. Right above, a menacing story about the shipment of firearms that had just arrived on the Australia for William R. Castle's company, Castle and Cook. This morning, the article says, "The arms and ammunition were placed on sale, and for several hours, a regular run was kept up on the deadly weapons. By noon, there was but little left of the entire shipment. Men of all nationalities," it claimed, "classes, conditions, and ages could be seen marching boldly off with the formidable implements in their hands or thrown across their shoulders." With a hint of irony, the story concluded, "It is hoped that no other use than target practice, goat shooting, etc., will ever be found for these arms." The story then was followed by the announcement barricading. It described how mechanics were securing the palace with barricades against a possible attack. The palace, it said, the palace gates have been barricaded today. Mechanics have been engaged on this work. This is a poor method of trying to stem popular feeling. Nobody wishes to do any harm to anybody within the palace walls or to anybody else. The people have been aroused to a sense of the iniquitous wrongs that have been perpetrated on them, and they are rising in their majesty to demand their rights. Barricading of palace walls is no obstacle to their demands, and will not prevent them from insisting upon their rights. Let no man be such a fool as to think that the people in this movement can be calmed or alarmed by such measures. The demands are reasonable and they must be conceded. During the same period that the League was gathering at the Honolulu Rifles Armory, plotting a revolution if the king did not concede, the Gazette, Daily Bulletin, and Herald were announcing the meetings, attacking Kalakaua and his advisors, and calling for change. Or, as Thuram put it, the government of the country is rotten. That is acknowledged on all hands. From the king downward, the government positions are chiefly held by men who are notoriously corrupt and debauched. There is not a department of the government that is not honeycombed with fraud. The Herald ranted at Gibson, the cabinet, and the king. Doubtless, Gibson will still cling to office like the limpet to a rock. If only the king fails to get a quartet subservient enough to pocket ministerial salaries while wrongs are unredressed and the crown is unpurged of notorious scandals. This article concludes with a death threat from Thuram. It says, "The people of this country have demands to make and demands which must be listened to, and any trickery in dealing with the taxpayers will recoil on the heads of those who attempt it with fatal effect." The Hawaiian League had been printing death threats against the king for some time, but the language still grew increasingly aggressive, and the accompanying articles about the arrival of weapons implied that a revolt was on the horizon. Intimidating headlines, which seemed to grow larger in font size, boasted of a mounting mutiny, like the story from the June 30th edition of the Bulletin. Mass meeting, a large gathering, pointed speeches, and so on. The liquor house closed. It must have been a big deal. The military under arms, great excitement. The white oligarchy was displaying a new level of boldness and nerve, with its members now daring enough to publish their indignation. These papers all claimed that the people included large members of Hawaiians and other non-Haole inhabitants, even though there is little evidence to support this. On June 30th, 1887, in an account of the mass meeting where the Reform Party outlined its plans for taking over the kingdom, the bulletin claimed that the room was jammed full, including a large smattering of Chinese. The Herald went further. Here are gathered people of all nationalities, Hawaiians, Americans, English, Portuguese, and Chinese. As for the PCA, the Pacific Commercial Advertiser, which was at this time no longer run by Walter Mary Gibson and did not support the monarchy, it agreed that a large crowd of all nationalities nearly filled the building, but comparatively speaking, there were very few Hawaiians, and its list of attendees included only 14 Chinese men. Jonathan Osorio pointed out the obvious. There were no native members of the Hawaiian League. One of the most insidious influences on Kalakaua's reputation, and particularly on the degree of support for him at the time, was therefore the English language opposition newspapers' habitual practice of claiming that a very small, self-interested minority of the population actually represented the thoughts of the whole. The Daily Herald had no problem claiming that all honest men really want a new constitution. While on July 5th, 1887, the Gazette's front page screamed, government reform, the people roused 2,500 freemen in mass meeting. The PCA estimated the attendance at only 150. Evidence for historian Helen Chapin's claim that newspapers inflated numbers of attendees at events they supported and deflated numbers at those they didn't. Clearly, among friends, reporters for the pro-Hawaiian League papers could publish detailed first-hand accounts of this meeting. A committee of 13 was created to present the mo'i with the demands: the dismissal of Gibson, the king's refunding of $71,000 to the government, and his vow to remove himself from campaigning for the elections of representatives. He was no longer to draw on government funds, supposedly the public monies belonging to the people who had been thrown aside and spent in every possible way. The newspapers published not only the attacks on the king, but the names of the men who made them. While members of the rifle stood with fixed bayonets outside the armory at the corner of Beretania and Punch Bowl, those inside listened to Sanford B. Dole and Lauren A. Thurston stir the crowd into going straight to the king with their demands. The criticism was personal. Alexander Young declared, "Kalakaua had had a great many years to let us see whether he was a man or not. The tension about our hearts had long been strained, and today the strings had broken. We must express ourselves. If the king would not do what was wanted, he must be made to do it." Cecil Brown added that, "We want the king to think of the public good, not of his personal ends. We have just seen the Jubilee of Queen Victoria, and if the king would follow her example, he might reign as long. But if Queen Victoria were to act as badly as Kalakaua, she would not live an hour." As for E.M. Walsh of Paia Plantation, he claimed that although the crowd did not want to use threats against the king, today they were prepared. Lieutenant Clarence W. Ashford claimed that he joined the Rifles 3 years before in anticipation of trouble such as they saw that day, and declared that the king had great many very pleasant qualities and many which were not so pleasant. Ashford agreed that the mo'i should be presented a new constitution. These non-Kanaka Maoli residents repeatedly claimed that they were Hawaiian by virtue of being born there or naturalized years before, and were representing the people by resisting not just Kalakaua's supposed tyranny, but the tyranny of monarchy itself. Or, as Ashford complained, the current constitution did not protect citizens' rights because it gave the king power which no monarch in any civilized country in the present day possessed. So entwined were the Hawaiian League and these newspapers that 2 years later, the Bulletin would proudly recall that when the League was ready for action, an independent press had long given warning that serious measures would be taken if reform was not granted. On the next day, July 6, 1887, the Hawaiian League threatened the king to sign what became known as the Bayonet Constitution. Through this extorted document, the Reform Party and Hawaiian League ended his right to appoint nobles and disband the cabinet. Now made up of members of the Hawaiian League, the new cabinet must ratify each of the king's decisions. Liliuokalani's summary of the League's wresting control of the king's power is accurate. She wrote, "The government in all its departments must be conducted by the cabinet. Your Majesty shall, in future, sign all documents and do all acts which, under the laws of the Constitution, require the signature or act of the sovereign, when advised so to do by the cabinet. The cabinet being solely and absolutely responsible for any signature of any document or act so done or performed by their advice." As Osorio explains, the Constitution removed every paradox that had previously confounded haole citizens and other white residents by making the nation belong to them without requiring that they belong to the nation. In short, the cabinet made up of self-proclaimed upright and able men became the mo'i, leaving Kalakaua to reign and not rule. Thurston and Sanford Doe, the masterminds of the overthrow, later observed that the natives had been unable to sustain the independent state which American residents had helped them create, and more specifically, that the constitutional encroachments, lawless extravagance, and scandalous and open sales of patronage and privilege to the highest bidder by Kalakaua brought on at length the Revolution of 1887. Or more succinctly, it was their opinion that Kalakaua seemed to be entirely given over to the devil. And that's a quote. It therefore was a constant that his opponents pointed to his alleged ignorance, ineptitude, and corrupt nature as sufficient reason for the necessity of the eventual overthrow of the kingdom. As Michael G. Vann explains, the first narratives of the demise of the Hawaiian monarchy were the product of those who had taken part in its overthrow. The writing of their histories was the final act of conquest, the intellectual consolidation of rule. In an 1886 campaign manifesto, Kalakaua and Gibson warned Kanakaʻoiwi about the white oligarchy. And this is a year prior to the Bayonet. They said, "The foreigners want to get the power in the Legislative Assembly by having the majority in the House on their side, so that the Hawaiians cannot have a voice in the administration of the affairs of the government of their country. These foreigners will deprive the Hawaiian people from having any voice in the government, because by taking your lands, they rob you of your right to vote and will reduce you to the level of the commonest laborer, depending on your living on the foreigner, the very ones who will rob you of your lands. If these foreigners who are against the Hawaiian race be victorious, then as true as there is light in the sun at midday, so will it also be true that all native Hawaiians will be kicked out from government positions. And who will fill their places? Who else but the white man? There, the foreigners' only wish and desire is that all Hawaiians die off, so that they can come in possession of all the native lands and money." The Gazette, Herald, and Bulletin all criticized Kalakaua and Gibson for making such predictions. They would, however, all come true. Tonight I've tried to give you an indication of what Kalakaua was up against and the charged political environment in which he operated. Beyond that, I hope that I have also given you a clearer understanding of where the libelous representations of the king, representations that have served as the basis for English language texts about the kingdom for more than a century, were first weaponized and deployed. In my upcoming book, I will present a fuller, more nuanced, more complete, and more accurate portrayal of the king using Hawaiian language. Using Hawaiian language texts, which have been largely ignored by English language historians. Mahalo.